reports from committees, Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Point of Pierre.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, would the Prime Minister please indicate what percentage of the shares in Trinidad Generation Unlimited, TGU, and the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago agreed to sell to Ferrostal GmbH?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this question and the next two questions can only be properly described as political mischief. In the mid-year review, Mr. Deputy Speaker, which
One sec. Can you refrain from that statement, please? Retract it.
No, stand up and retract it.
retracted.
Now listen, members, listen. It is very early in the sitting. It is 1:37. All right? I do not want to say that we have a long day ahead of us, but I'm not going to tolerate on both sides. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Sit, please. Member for Shogunas West. Would you like to tell me what I should do?
You're doing the right thing, Speaker.
Because keep in mind, I will respond based on how you all act. And I'm serious this afternoon. Early, I'm going to lay the cards on the table. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In my capacity as Minister of Finance, in the mid-year review presented in this House just about 2 months ago, I made it crystal clear that it was the government's intention to place a number of companies into the asset base of the National Investment Fund in order to offer shares, now bonds, to the general public. And one of the companies named by me in my capacity as Minister of Finance was Trinidad Generation Unlimited. It is therefore impossible, if the government is proceeding to use TGU as one of the assets to underpin the National Investment Fund, that the government would be selling any shares in TGU to Ferrostal. And this is why I say this question is political mischief. So the answer is 0.
Supplemental, Oropuchis.
To the substantive, to the Prime Minister. Could the Prime Minister indicate whether the decision taken by Cabinet on May 25th, 2017, by Cabinet Minute 922, to sell 40% of TGU to Ferrostal GmbH, has that decision been rescinded?
Minister of Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Obviously, if the Cabinet has endorsed the proposal for the National Investment Fund for the assets of TGU to be placed in the National Investment Fund company to underpin the National Investment Fund offering, obviously, this matter is no longer being pursued.
Supplemental, point of view.
To the Acting Prime Minister, could the Acting Prime Minister state when that asset in National Investment Fund comes into being with the percentage of TGU in it, would Ferrostal be able to purchase part of that asset base?
Acting Prime Minister.
Obviously not. The National Investment Fund, as I indicated recently in the public domain, will have an asset base which will be used to offer asset-backed bonds to the general public. Clearly, if the assets of the National Investment Fund company are to be used to back those bonds and to generate income to repay the bonds, then clearly no one, including Ferrostal, can purchase shares in TGU, as long as TGU remains in the asset base of the National Investment Fund. This is all very obvious and very clear. And to repeat, we are selling 0% of the shares to Ferrostal or anybody else. We are not selling any shares in TGU.
I recognize the member for Tabaki.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Acting Prime Minister, given that the Cabinet had taken a decision to sell shares to Ferrostal, and now you're claiming it's been rescinded, is there any liability on the part of the government to Ferrostal, or can Ferrostal lay claim to the government in any regard for rescinding of such a decision?
Acting Prime Minister.
Firstly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not claiming anything. I'm stating a fact. We are not selling any shares to Ferrostal. And the answer to your question, there's no liability whatsoever. It was an offer which was dependent on an acceptance from the government and preconditions and conditions precedent, and that transaction was not completed. There is no liability whatsoever. And I want to say again, the government is not selling any shares in TGU to Ferrostal or anybody else for that matter. And it is impossible because TGU's assets are going to be placed to underpin the National Investment Fund, among others. TGU shares.
Question 2, member for Point of View, would you forego the, or you still want to
1, 3,
entertain the question?
Now irrelevant.
Deputy Prime Minister, Becky Sita, I would withdraw question 2 and 3 based on the answer from the acting Prime
fine.
Minister.
Question number 4, member for Couva South.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, could the Acting Prime Minister inform this House of the number of Venezuelan migrants who are employed in the Red House restoration project?
Honourable Prime Minister acting.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am advised that the Urban Development Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago is currently conducting an investigation by making inquiries of all of the contractors and subcontractors employed on the Red House restoration project. Until that investigation is completed and the information is received, it is not possible to answer this question with respect to the number, whether there are any, or 1 or 2, as the case may be. However, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to make the point. Members opposite have to make up their minds. When 82 Venezuelans were repatriated recently, there was a hue and cry and a hullabaloo and a fuss coming from the other side about the actions of the government. And they demanded that we give Venezuelans refugee status. Members opposite have to make up their minds, because if you are going to give Venezuelan refugees refugee status, or Venezuelans refugee status, then you have to allow them to work as part of the refugee process. So make up your minds. Is either you want Venezuelans to get refugee status or you don't.
I recognize the member for St. Augustine.
Is the acting Prime Minister saying that you're now adopting a policy of allowing refugee status by the employment through indirect means? It's for the government to make up their mind.
Mr. Deputy Speaker,
Prime Minister, acting.
I didn't really, there was a lot of crosstalk down there. I would ask the honourable member to repeat the question, please.
Member for St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. Is the acting Prime Minister indicating a possible move to a policy of allowing Venezuelans here as refugees through indirectly employing them through the state?
Prime Minister.
I think
acting.
there's a question later on that deals with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think number 12 talks about the policy with respect to refugees. The point I'm making is that if a person is admitted as a refugee in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the conditions is that they must be allowed to work. So that if members opposite want this government to just accept Venezuelan nationals wholesale as refugees, then we must allow them to work. And this is why I'm asking them, make up your minds. What do you want? Do you want us to grant refugee status wholesale to Venezuelan nationals or not? Make up your mind. Because if we are to grant as a country, grant them refugee status, then we must allow them to work. That's part of the process. I'm sure the member for Naparima could educate all of you about refugee matters.
I recognize the member for Couva South.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I would ask the Acting Prime Minister to make up his mind in responding to the opposition this evening. You, hold on, Attorney
Members,
General.
members.
is the acting Prime Minister telling this House that refugees are currently employed in the Red House restoration project?
I will not entertain that question, member.
I answered that already.
Supplemental?
In relation to the investigation that the acting Prime Minister alluded to, could the acting Prime Minister also commit the government to investigating whether the labor laws of Trinidad and Tobago are being upheld in this Red House restoration project from the point of view of personal protective gear, overtime, and I could go on and on in terms of compensation and so on.
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm certain that UDCORT will cover all eventualities and all issues in the investigation. I'm sure they will make a comprehensive report on whether there are any Venezuelan migrants whatsoever working for any subcontractor on the Red House project and whether these persons are working there legally or not, as the case may be. But we have not yet received any report from UDCORT. There was only a newspaper article in a weekend newspaper. The investigation is ongoing, so the question cannot be answered at this time.
Member for Couva South, question number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again to the acting Prime Minister. Could the acting Prime Minister inform this House if the retrofitting works on the MV Galleons Passage in Santiago, Cuba, has been completed?
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the arrangement for the enhancement works on the MV Galleons Passage had two components. There were works to be done by the seller of the vessel, certain upgrade works, and there were also upgrade works to be done by the buyer of the vessel, which in this particular case was the National Infrastructure Development Company on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that the seller had work to do at his expense with his own arrangements on a contractual basis with the shipyard in Cuba, and NIDCO also had work to do on a contractual basis based on a separate transaction with the shipyard in Cuba. We have been informed recently that some of the materials and equipment that the seller requires in order to complete the enhancement works that were agreed to in the contract for sale of the vessel to NIDCO, some of these materials and equipment, the seller is having difficulty transporting them from Australia to Cuba because Cuba is still an embargo country for many countries. Cuba accepts shipments from some European countries and does not apparently make it very easy for shipments from countries such as Australia. The seller has reported that to us recently, that although fabrication of one of the canopies had begun, they were having difficulty in getting an airline or a shipping company to transport some of the remaining equipment and materials for the canopies into Cuba. So the government has taken a decision to bring the vessel to Trinidad immediately. The work will be done in Trinidad, and the boat will be put into service very soon, and the enhancement work will be done on a phased basis while the boat is transporting passengers to and from Tobago.
I recognize the member for Couva South.
The acting Prime Minister informed this House whether any retrofitting work was done in Santiago, Cuba.
Acting Prime Minister.
Based on the reports received from NIDCO, the answer is yes.
I recognize the member for Naparima.
Is the acting Prime Minister, was the government aware of the fact that there's an embargo in Cuba, and was that taken on board in making the decision to go there?
Members, Prime Minister, acting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The seller of the vessel Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm having a little trouble with all the noise over there. I would seek your protection, please.
Yes. Proceed, member. I will protect accordingly. Proceed.
Thank you very much. As part of the contract for purchase of the vessel, the seller of the vessel had agreed to do certain enhancement works at the Damen shipyard in Cuba. This was a contractual responsibility of the seller, not a contractual responsibility of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. The works that the seller is contracted to do have been affected by the seller's inability to get materials and equipment into Cuba, not the government's inability to get materials and equipment into Cuba.
Stop babbling now.
I recognize the member for Urupuchis.
Thank you so much. Mr. Acting Prime Minister, notwithstanding the embargo on Cuba, are you aware that in April this year, the United States Department of Homeland Security, under which the United States Coast Guard reports in specific matters, found that this vessel that you got from the seller that didn't know it had an embargo in Cuba
Question,
was
please.
found to be defective by the U.S. Coast Guard on inspection in Hawaii?
I would not entertain that question, member. I now recognize the member for Shogunas West.
Thank you. Mr. Deputy Speaker, could the Honourable Acting Prime Minister indicate whether or not these enhancements and these changes have been classified by the classification authority that is responsible for the safety of shipping? Ships of that nature.
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The vessel was classified by Lloyd's of London in its original condition as being suitable for coastal transport of passengers and cargo. So the vessel is already classified. The enhancement works to be done on the vessel are simply to make the vessel more comfortable for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But as we speak, the vessel is already in class and is already certified by Lloyd's of London to transport passengers and cargo in coastal areas.
Supplemental question 6 now. Couva South. Question 6.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the Acting Prime Minister inform this House whether the Office of the Key has received the report of the three-member committee headed by Ms. Jackie Wilson to investigate the circumstances which led to the payment of $150,000 to a former employee of the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs?
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you very much. Yes, the report was received on the 4th of June, 2018.
Couva South. Supplemental.
In the interest of transparency and good governance, to which the PNM subscribed to, are they willing to lay that report in this House?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the life sport report, the PNM government, this PNM government, will follow due process. When there's a report that involves the conduct of someone, they have a right to be heard and a right to answer any accusations made against them. So unlike the UNC, we are following due process and allowing natural justice to be developed.
Question number 7. Member for Couva North.
Thank you. Could the Acting Prime Minister say if Sandals International will be the recipient of a tax holiday as seen in other CARICOM countries, since the Prime Minister stated the hotel will be constructed and managed locally?
Prime Minister acting.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think this is an ideal opportunity to clarify and to deal with some of the mischief in the political domain. The model being used for the Sandals Hotel has been stated by the Honourable Prime Minister himself, by the Minister in the Ministry of the Office of the Prime Minister. The model being used is the Hyatt model, where the government will own the property, and the brand, in this particular case Sandals, will manage and operate the hotel, and the government receives the profits from the operations of the hotel. The questions of tax concessions, these are standard in the industry, and they are still being negotiated and have not yet been finalized.
Supplemental Cuba note.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, can the acting Prime Minister say if and when the Memorandum of Understanding between the Trinidad and Tobago government and Sandals International will be made public?
I would not entertain that question. Member for Naparima.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we thank you for the enlightenment with respect to the model that is being used. But could you tell us, in the development of that model, what is the total equity input of the Trinidad and Tobago taxpayer, the return on investment on that money, and the break-even time frame, so that we could see value for money in Trinidad and Tobago?
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Silence, please.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Hyatt model has been very, very successful. In fact, the Hyatt has almost paid for itself since its construction in 2008, 2009 for the Summit of the Americas. The government has received hundreds of millions of dollars from the Hyatt's operations since then. The precise details that the honourable member is asking for cannot be given at this point in time. But based on preliminary data, we expect the Sandals Resort International in Tobago to be as successful as the Hyatt, if not more successful in terms of return on equity, in terms of economic activity, in terms of the profitability, and in terms of the overall beneficial effect on Tobago economy and also the Trinidad economy.
Naparima.
Surely, thank you, Mr. Deputy. Surely, as Minister of Finance, you must have at your fingertips the profitability and return on investment on the Hyatt model. Please, could you tell this Honourable House? What is the return on investment to date with the Hyatt, since this is the model used for Sandals, and the break-even time project?
Member, I would not entertain the question based on the answer that was just given. It will be provided accordingly. You had your hand up, Kuva not again? Okay. Kumuto Manzelina.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, can you indicate there are two different models, the Hyatt model and the Sandals model. The Sandals model is representative. The Sandals is representative of an all-inclusive. And all-inclusive is very different to the Hyatt. And therefore, as such, in light of the information that has been going worldwide, that all-inclusives do not bring in direct investment to a country, how do you propose that we will get a return of our investment with a Sandals model compared to Hyatt?
Member, I would not entertain that question. Members, question number 8, Kuva North.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the acting Prime Minister give an update on the land acquisition process for construction of the new Tobago Airport Terminal?
Prime Minister acting.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Public consultations have been held and are ongoing. The Section 3 and 4 notices have not yet been served, but will be served shortly.
Member for Naparima.
Prime Minister, tell us whether small hoteliers would be affected by the land acquisition, and therefore priority is being given to a Sandals model as opposed to a model that will involve small business development.
Member, which question you would like to pose?
Yes, I want to know if local hoteliers, local hoteliers would be affected by the land acquisition process.
Right, thank you. Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The terminal building at the Crown Point A&R Robinson International Airport in Tobago is many, many, many years old. As far as I can recall, it was done in the NER era. So that would make it at least 25 years old, if not older. And that small terminal building has long outgrown its usefulness. This project is a new terminal building, not necessarily a new airport, a new terminal building, which will be located at the other end of the runway, and the lands in that particular area are to be acquired for the construction of the terminal building. There are a number of parcels there. There are vacant lands, there are residences and other properties in the area. When the Section 3 and Section 4 notices are finalized and the acquisition is approved by Cabinet, the actual serving of the Section 3 and Section 4, then the details that the Honourable Member is requesting can be provided.
Next question.
Supplemental.
Chief Whip, guide me, please. Are you accepting it?
Yes.
Okay. Shogunas
Supplemental to
West.
the Acting Prime Minister. The acquisition of the lands for the Tobago terminal, new terminal, is by compulsory acquisition, Section 3 and Section 4. But the acquisition of the lands for the Curepe interchange is by private treaty. Why is there a distinction?
Would not entertain that question. Next question, number 9, Kuva North. Kuva
Thank you,
North.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the acting Prime Minister say if he will accede to the wishes of the Tobago people and consider full independence for them, as was expressed at a recent consultation on the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018?
Acting Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I must have confessed I'm a bit taken aback by this question, since the Honourable Member for Kuva North is a member of the Joint Select Committee, which is considering the proposals from the people of Tobago for more autonomy. It is my information that it is incorrect to state, and I think this again falls into the realm of political mischief, it is incorrect to state that the people of Tobago want full independence. My understanding that at this recent consultation, one person, one asked for full independence. It is my understanding, based on advice received from eminent Tobagonians, including the Honourable Prime Minister, the members of this House who represent Tobago East and West, and many other eminent Tobagonians who were part of the process to grant Tobago more autonomy, is that no one, apart from maybe this one person, in Tobago is demanding full independence for Tobago. So this is a mischievous question.
Question number 10, Kuva
Thank
North.
you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could the Prime Minister say if he has received an audit report or has been updated on the investigation into the missing $10 million from the THA accounts meant for Virgin Atlantic Airways?
Acting Prime Minister.
An audit report has not been received. However, I am advised that the Central Audit Committee of the Ministry of Finance conducted an investigation some months ago and is currently in the process of finalizing its report into this matter. And I'm advised by the Tobago House of Assembly that the fraud squad is also investigating this matter, but no reports are available and no final conclusions are available at this time. But investigations have been conducted.
Member for Kuva North, supplemental.
Just one. Mr. Acting Prime Minister, how soon before we get the report on the investigation? And why is there not an...
Member, one
Sorry.
question is the procedure. Acting Prime Minister.
With respect to the report from the Central Audit Committee, the information I received today from the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that the report is currently being finalized. It would be premature of me to give you an exact date as to the completion of that report.
Question number 11, Princess Town.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister, could the Prime Minister indicate whether he has received a response from the United Nations regarding his complaint about their local representative commenting on the repatriation of over 82 Venezuelan nationals?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm advised that the Prime Minister has not received a response from the United Nations regarding the complaint. However, I'm also advised that the person in question, the local representative, is leaving.
He's left.
Member for Princestown.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, could the Honourable Prime Minister say whether in light of the comments made by the Honourable Prime Minister on this issue, where he indicated on April 27 that there are people who want us to join them in invading Venezuela, and we are not doing that, has
Question,
been met
please.
by the U.S. government with concerns as expressed to the government? Could he confirm that? Could the Honourable Prime Minister confirm that the U.S. government has expressed concerns over these statements by the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, that there are persons who are interested in having us join them to invade Venezuela? Those were the words of the Prime Minister.
Member, I would not entertain that question. Members, the time for Prime Minister's questions has now expired.